Welcome to the Exam Study Expert Podcast, helping you ace your exams at school and university through the psychology of high performance and the science of studying smarter, not harder. It's my pleasure to introduce your host, the Cambridge-trained memory psychologist and exam success coach, William Wadsworth.
Hello and welcome to the 100th anniversary special of the Exam Study Expert podcast. Today we'll be looking back and looking forward in a special celebration to mark the big 100. Today's entertainment is laid on in three separate acts. In the middle act, I'm going to be welcoming back to the stage a very special surprise guest for a follow-up interview to her smash hit original interview here on the podcast. I've given you a little bit of a clue there by referring to as a her, but we've met so many incredible female guests on the show in the first 100 episodes, you will just have to stay tuned to find out who it is. In the third and final act today, we will be welcoming my exam study expert colleagues, Doctors Alex Hibble and Kerry Edinburgh, to share what they wish they'd known in their own student days. Kerry and Alex both contribute so much to what Exam Study Expert is today. It was really important to me that our 100th episode features the full team behind Exam Study Expert as it is at the moment. So that's Kerry and Alex as well as myself. But first, Act 1 begins with us handing out a few awards. I wanted to take this opportunity to look back through the catalogue of the first 100 episodes and pick out my 10 favourite picks. This is going to be a mix of some of my own picks in various award categories, as well as some picks that naturally rose through to the top by virtue of their sheer popularity with all of you listening. So, kicking us off at 10th place, we have the award for Best Student Story, which goes to Jomar from episode 18. It was hard to pick out from the growing number of wonderful and inspiring students who told their story here on the show, but if you've heard Joe's story, I think you'll agree it's something quite special. In at 9th place is the award for Best Compilation, which goes to the fabulous PhD candidates in episode 17 who shared their tips for surviving a PhD. And congratulations to all of those who now have their doctorates. We don't do many compilation episodes because they're a bit of a beast to edit, but it's a pretty cool format and something I do like to drop in from time to time. And I was particularly proud of how that one came out. At 8th place is the award I'm calling the biggest fanboy moment, which goes to Professor Tim Wilson in episode 42. Redirect, change your story, change your life. The book of that same name that inspired this episode, by Professor Tim Wilson, of course, is one of my all-time favourite reads. And one day I plucked up the courage to write to its author to see if I could possibly convince him to come on the show. And I remember having a proper giddy fanboy moment when he said yes. And it went on to be a really, really good conversation that I thoroughly enjoyed. Moving swiftly into 7th place is the Lifetime Service Award, which goes to Brian Tracy from episode 39. He was some 77 years of age when we recorded our conversation about eating the frog and beating procrastination, and I was really tickled at the end of our chat when he said he had to go and get on with his 91st book, which he kept procrastinating on. Brian Tracy, it's been an absolute honour. Let's go and eat some frogs.
Let's go and eat some frogs. I've got lots of frogs to get on with. I got my 91st book, which I've got to get finished. I'm behind on it because I keep procrastinating.
Even one of the founding fathers of the world of self-development and time management is not immune to procrastination, folks. In at number 6, a relative newcomer to the Exam Study Expert Library, Ruth Poundwhite from episode 97. She wins our award for Best Critical Reception, which is based on the unusual number of pieces of feedback that, completely unsolicited, completely unprompted, were dropping into my email inbox and even into my personal WhatsApps. People I sometimes didn't even know listened to the show, who were getting in touch to say how much they'd appreciated that episode. So do have a listen if you haven't already. We're moving now swiftly into the top 5, and at 5th place is our award for Best Advice. This may sound like quite a hard one to award. I like to think we give out quite a lot of good advice on the podcast. But in my mind, there's one clear frontrunner for this award, because I've been referring back to something she said just about every single time I teach motivation in group workshops in schools and universities. This is Erica Patel from episode 43.
The practice or myth I wish I could debunk would be that social comparison is a good way to motivate oneself. Students often rely a lot on social comparison to motivate themselves. And while that competition does motivate, there is a lot of psychological costs of using that strategy that maybe make it not worth it.
Wise words there from one of the world's leading academics on the science of study motivation. In at number 4 is one of my solo episodes. It's episode 66, How to Study Effectively, the 6 Pillars of Student Success. I've chosen this one because I recommend it as a starting point for any new listeners to the show, and it's one I'd absolutely suggest coming back to from time to time, because it's where I lay out the 6 things that I think are most important of all to think about if you're aiming to study effectively for your exams. You can actually download a summary of all of those 6 big ideas at examstudyexpert.com/pillars. PILLARS, examstudyexpert.com/pillars. Places 3 and 2 on the list go to the joint winners of the Listener's Choice category. This award category was based on a survey that a good many of you filled out a couple of months back, so thank you so much if you took the time to do that. One of my questions in that listener survey was for you to pick which your favourite episodes were from the episodes that had been broadcast to date at the time. There were many, many episodes that people were selecting as personal favourites, but there were 2 runaway winners that came out joint top by, again, some considerable margin. Both, again, were solo episodes. They were episode 10 study hacks, 10 practical tips to cut your study hours and boost your grades, as well as episode 3 on how to study 2 seriously powerful ways to improve memory. Episode 3 also has the second highest listening figures of any episode to date. So when I look in the listening stats in my podcast host, that comes out second place all time for the most listens. But I've saved the number 1 award on this list for the episode with the overall highest listening figures, which is a record this particular episode holds by a very considerable margin. I've also heard anecdotally that for many of you, it's the first episode you ever listened to, and I know at least some of you have made a point of revisiting that episode more than once for a fresh dose of motivation and mindset refresh. This, of course, is our very first ever episode, all the way back to episode 1. You can do this. Mindset for Exam Success with Lucy Ratcliffe. If you add together the listener figures we had both for the original broadcast in episode 1 and the summer rewind replay I did of that episode a year or so back, her listening figures are some 50% higher than the second placed episode on the listener figures chart. It's also noteworthy as the only interview episode in the top 5 most listened episodes. All of the other top 5 were solo episodes. So I thought it'd be a very fitting way to celebrate the 100th episode than to bring back our most popular guest to date, Lucy Ratcliffe herself, for an update. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen. Lucy Ratcliffe is here in the building with us tonight, and we'll be welcoming her back to the stage for a brand new mini interview for us all in just a few moments' time, when we'll be catching up on mindset, handling the pressure, managing your self-talk, and her recent experiences from a ringside seat of exam taking as a parent of a student taking her exams. Just before we bring Lucy on, I wanted to just conclude the first act, wrap up the awards segment of today's celebration with some honourable mentions. As I was putting this list together, I remember with huge fondness conversations that didn't quite make the top 10, but still are very, very dear to my heart, and I know have been very popular amongst many of you. Episodes with the likes of Carolina Cooper-Tetzel, Veronica Yan, Adam Putnam, Kendra Adachi, Chris Bailey, Stefan van der Stiechel, Joachim Cassell, and so many others, as well as all the students who recorded a student story episode. Huge shout out to you if you're listening to the show, any of you. A massive thank you to each and every one of our wonderful guests on behalf of all of the listeners of the Exam Study Experts podcast. And now, without further ado, please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome back to Lucy Ratcliffe. Lucy, a very warm welcome back to the Exam Study Expert podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be back.
It's wonderful to see you again. For those of us who haven't listened to episode 1, or at least not in a little while, remind us a little bit of what your work is all about.
Certainly. I work as a coach primarily. That's probably the best label for the work that I do in large and small organizations all over the world, helping people broadly in the context of how they communicate, how they lead, how they work together. So it's really an opportunity to work with people in and around their lives at work. So through that, I get to talk about everything from practical skills like how to present and how to communicate and manage relationships, right the way through to big questions around confidence and who we are and how we show up and perform at the level that we want to in our organization. So I always say in a slightly flip way, it's the best job in the world, but I get to do all sorts of really interesting things and talk to some amazing people over the years, including you, William, because you worked with me in a previous life. So you'll remember some of the conversations we had.
That's right. That's how we met originally, and back in the very early days of the podcast, when I was thinking about wonderful and inspiring and fascinating people to invite on to talk about, you were one of the first people I thought of, and I thought, oh gosh, wouldn't it be great if we could have a chat and share some of your ideas as might be relevant to students and people studying for exams. And as I mentioned when we were talking over email, your original episode 1, has actually gone on to be our most listened to episode ever so far. There's obviously been something really powerful about that episode that's struck people, and I've talked to people that have gone and listened back to it at least a couple of times. And I guess my first question to you was, you've been teaching this stuff for some time now. What do you think is it about the power of the ideas you're teaching?
Well, before I go into that, I'm so delighted to hear that the podcast is resonating with people. That really means a lot. And I think it's a really interesting question, and we sit with it in our business all of the time. There's 2 ways I think I would answer it. So I mentioned that our work spans a big cross-section of different areas. So when we're working in a very functional, practical area like presentation skills or how you communicate, I think the power of the work comes from that sense of achievement people get. So like any practical skill, if you're talking to people about how to put a presentation together, how to structure ideas, how to speak in a way that people will listen and catch your thinking, and then how to deliver in a confident way, things like body language and all of those very practical skills, I think there's nothing like the experience of starting in one place and ending up somewhere better. So I think that sense of real achievement that people feel in and for themselves in some of our more functional, practical work is part of it. And then I'm very lucky, particularly in some of the more recent work I've been doing in the last couple of years since we recorded the podcast. So I'm working in a lot of organizations in and around the diversity and inclusion space. And in that context, some of the conversations that we get to have go to some really powerful places. So we'll be talking to people about how they think about themselves. We've talked in the last podcast around mindset and how important that conversation you have with you is in determining what happens to you. And I think there's an extra layer on top of that around not just how we think, but how we feel about ourselves. Working with areas of identity. Who are we and how do we show up in environments where we're maybe safe or maybe less safe in our authentic living of our sense of who we are. So when you're working in such a precious, important space with people, I think the power that our work can have is I think it makes people feel witnessed and seen and allows people in some of those bigger, deeper conversations to feel seen by themselves. So it's almost as if people get to meet themselves in a different way through some of the conversations that we have. And that's a great privilege to be part of that. So I think it's those 2 areas. It's both that sense of achievement and being better at something at the end of a session than you were at the beginning, but also that opportunity to really sit with yourself in an environment where there are often people going through similar experiences, and recognizing some important things about who you are and what you value and how you show up.
So in your home life at the moment, Lucy, I know there's someone I won't use the word work with because that sounds very transactional, doesn't it? But there's someone very close to you who's been going through the exam process. For those of you listening overseas, GCSEs are the UK exams we sit when we're around kind of 15, 16. And I know your daughter's kind of been going through this process recently, Lucy. How's it been?
It's like anything. When you actually live something, it's very, very different to all the theories and even the memory that I have of going through exams in my teenage years. And I think the first reflection I would have that it's really, really hard for students and young people at this stage in their life. I think regardless of how well schools try to embed all their messages about the importance of exams in well-being. I know lots of schools are doing great work in and around the mental health space and support. I think certainly my daughter's peers have taken the message that this is make or break, and that if they don't succeed in GCSEs, the rest of their life is going to be impacted. And that's a lot of pressure to be living with. And I think the pressure was different. The world was very different when I was sitting similar exams. But I think that the one thing that you don't have in your teenage years yet, because you haven't had enough experience to develop it fully, is perspective. So as a parent and an adult, I can know and say to my daughter, listen, there are all kinds of routes to having a fulfilling and successful life. Success in exams is one part of it. Do your best, all the things that good supportive parents say. But if you don't have that experience bank to know that you'll be okay, whatever happens, whether you succeed with flying colours and the grades that you want or whether you don't, I think that's a very difficult space to be in. So I think my overriding feeling as a parent is the importance to try and bring perspective, but also empathy. You know, it's really hard and it's really tough, and there's a lot of pressure and there's a lot of support I think parents need to be able to offer through just recognizing. I said to my daughter the other day, I don't think I'd actually make it through till first break if I was living your life at the moment. So I think that empathy as a parent is important, and to try and encourage it into helping our students or our children or our young people feel that sense of empathy for themselves, which is like, this is hard. This is something that I'm going to need to manage over the extended period of the exam process. And in my experience so far, the whole of year 11, which is the GCSE year in the UK, seems to be this period of extended pressure. That's a long time. If I think of the adult world that I work in, the level of pressure, the level of stress that young people are operating under through such an extended period of time, that's really tough, and many adults would crumble, and few adults, I think, experience this particular kind of pressure. You know, we have important meetings, we have important projects, deadlines, presentations. We need, the pressures of leadership can be hugely challenging, of course, but this kind of sense that if I don't do this now, the rest of my life is going to be blown. I think trying to work against that story, I think, is really important. So that's my perspective really as a parent, that it's really tough. And that's without taking into account the impact of the pandemic in the last couple of years. This particular group of students going through exams this year, whether it's GCSE, A-levels, degree level, other exams that people are experiencing, chances are they've all been severely impacted on what has happened in the last couple of years. Whether it's A-level students in the UK this year sitting the first public exams that they've done. They didn't necessarily all go through the conventional GCSE approach. I think that's tough. As my daughter reminds me, she's the first year that are not having any allowances made for the fact that they lived through the pandemic in crucial formative years, and being stuck in your bedroom at 13 with your mum and dad, if you're lucky enough to be in a safe environment, even that's hard. So I feel huge empathy, not sympathy. I think the difference between those two things are really important. That idea of walking with, not trying to fix or be positive in a way of, oh, come on, everything's going to be all right, but just really understanding it's a hard time. And there are lots of ways in which we're going to need to support young people through the pressure and the challenge of the next few months.
It's really interesting you talk about how adults would feel going back and taking exams now. Like, I live and breathe the reality of exam taking sort of every single day through doing what I do. That's not to say I'm actually there taking the exams anymore. It's been quite a few years since I did. And when I look back on my own time, GCSEs, A-levels, getting my degree from Cambridge, I sometimes have this conversation with my wife, would we go back and do our time as a student again? And she sometimes says, actually, yeah, I might. I generally say, no, thanks. I feel I went in, I did my job, definitely felt quite a lot of pressure at the time, for sure. And I'm glad to have come out the other side. And, I went and did a good job, did well. I'm very glad. I'm very proud looking back. I wouldn't necessarily want to go through the whole thing again, for sure. And it's interesting you talked about the post-pandemic phenomenon. It's a perennial theme, this idea of feeling the pressure. But we've been hearing that theme, I think, even more so post-pandemic. And it's a slightly strange one sometimes when you think about it, because everybody in your cohort is in exactly the same boat. Nobody had that exam experience. Everybody in your daughter's cohort is sitting, the first set of GCSEs that haven't had allowances for several years. So in a way, it's kind of a level-ish playing field, maybe with a few lumps and bumps. Yet people still feel that pressure on them.
Yeah, and I think if I'm making some of the links between some of the ways in which our work has evolved through this last period since we made our first podcast together, I think one of the things that I realized in terms of the work that we do and how we respond to that pressure, and this I think has implications for students and young people listening, is that the world changed overnight and became a very different way to live, and a frightening time for all sorts of reasons. So I think our responses to what have happened have had to shift. And I think if we recognize that the level of the pressure is the same across the board, that the exams are largely going to be the same in terms of the questions that are asked of students. So the opportunity for the different shift, I think, comes in our responsiveness. And this is what I've talked a lot about in my work in organizations with leaders and different individuals, the difference between reacting and responding. So we can make a really clear distinction between those two things. I think in a reaction is often instant and unconscious, whereas a response is something that we choose. So there's a new way that we've been talking to people more recently, which is connected to helping people really see and understand themselves differently. So not just from a mindset point of view, as we talked about last time, but it was a line I came across quite by accident. For years, we've talked about the art of being yourself in our work, particularly in the space around identity. What does it mean to be you, to be your authentic self? It's those are ideas that have been around for a long time and are quite abstract, I think, in the context of what that actually means. What does it mean to be yourself? And so of all the things, I was writing an Instagram post one day and just wrote this line, the art of seeing yourself. And it was one of those moments where I thought, oh, I like that. That's much better than the art of being yourself. So it feels infinitely more practical to think about, okay, what happens to me? Seeing yourself is recognizing it under this pressure, this extended period of pressure. What happens to me? How do I talk to myself? What are my emotions doing? And seeing the emotional responses we have as information that help us. Okay, so when I feel pressure, I get frightened, or when I feel pressure, I want to block it out and go and do something else. So rather than revising, which I know might help me, I'm going to go and see my friends because I don't want to think about the pressure that I'm under. So the better we can understand and see ourselves, recognize patterns of thinking, how emotions show up, how we work through those emotions rather than necessarily pushing them away, patterns of behavior, the practice of self-observation, I think, is one of the richest places for us to understand and move through into our potential. So I know it's very consistent with some of the work you do around retrieval and revision and working with practicing, accessing the knowledge. I think one of the things that I've recognized more and more through this process of seeing ourselves is the idea that, the confidence we need to do our best job in an exam, in those moments when the pressure is on, is there. It's inside us. We all have confidence in different contexts, but what happens when the pressure comes is that confidence can be blocked. So there's a big opportunity for all of us to think, I think, how do I access that state of confidence that is in me, and what are the things that are blocking it? So, if pressure creates that sense of panic, for example, like, I can't remember everything I know, we can get overtaken. Our body becomes flooded with all the fear and all the hormonal shifts that happen that literally stop us being able to access the things that we know that we need to be able to pull out and articulate in an exam or high pressure situation. So I think our opportunities are to think about, when I say I recognize that things are really hard, that doesn't let us off the hook, whether it's life being hard for us as adults or the pressure of exams and all the stuff I talked about a moment ago about how difficult it is for young people today. That's the river that we're all swimming in. So our only opportunity to think about is how do I respond to that? How am I going to respond to the pressure, the stress, the nerves, so that I can access the things that I know when I need them, and that state of confidence that's going to allow me to perform at the level that I want to do what I need to do. So that practice of seeing yourselves, what happens to you? What are you feeling? What are you thinking? How are you talking to yourself? How are you behaving? If there's an opportunity for us to develop those skills of self-observation early on in our lives, if we can develop those skills in our formative teenage years, again, the possibilities in terms of what happens as our life unfolds, that's where opportunity comes from, I think, to access the things that we need to be able to do in order to get where we want to in our lives, to look at our responses, and rather than reacting to pressure, making some choices about how you want to deal with that pressure.
I think it's such a powerful tool for kind of overcoming so many different kinds of obstacles that come in your path. The example that just randomly sprung to mind while you were talking was, I was having a conversation with a student recently about focus and distractions, and this is another very, very common question from people of all ages, but let's say teenagers in particular. Getting distracted with technology, your phone, and our starter advice is, well, if you are able to turn your phone off, leave it out of the room while you're studying, you will be less distracted, you'll lose less time, your concentration will be better, you'll get your work done faster, and it will be to a higher standard. Like, it seems like a win-win, and you'll have more free time to do whatever you're wanting to do on your phone later. Anyway, this student challenged it and said, well, I'm just going to be sitting there worrying what's coming on my phone. Worrying, I'll be sitting there distracted because I want to go and check my phone. And when you get a little bit deeper, you sort of start to ask yourself, well, why is that? And possibly one of the reasons is your brain's almost searching for ways to distract yourself from something that might be a little bit painful, something might be a little bit hard. The work you're doing, you might be a little bit stuck on it. And so it's looking for any kind of way out of that slightly painful, work that you need to do. And sometimes it helps us get unstuck if we're able to just have that patience with ourselves and allow ourselves to kind of sit with that discomfort for a little while. I think this particularly happens with quite bright students for whom the feeling of being a little bit stuck or finding things hard is a little bit alien. It's a new feeling. It's not what you're used to. You're used to picking it up quite quickly. And those can be quite uncomfortable moments. And so you find sort of ways out, like distracting yourself with tech, for example.
Well, I think that speaks to something that's been a big focus of our work in the space of understanding emotion, recently influenced by lots of great psychologists like Susan David, who talks about emotional agility. But that recognition that we have been conditioned into thinking that emotions are either positive or negative. So discomfort is something that we want to not feel, and emotions that are perceived to be negative, we need to push away because we shouldn't somehow be feeling them. Whereas if we shift to a place of seeing all emotions as data or information, there's an opportunity to respond very differently. So if there's a rising sense of discomfort, that's a great opportunity to think, okay, discomfort, interesting. What's making me feel uncomfortable right now? And what's that telling me that I need to do or that is important to me right now. So if it's discomfort that's arising from the pressure to do well because you're a bright student and the expectations are really high, there's an opportunity to notice that, recognize it, and that tiny degree of separation when you're observing how you feel, it takes you out of feeling it. So it's a wonderful opportunity to step outside yourself. So this idea of seeing yourself is like having another version of you on your shoulder all of the time. Oh, I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling panicky. I'm feeling distracted. What's that telling me? And so I think this whole approach of really trying to build that sense of self-observation can be a huge part of the process of getting yourself into the right mindset, emotional state to be able to do what you need to do when the pressure is at its highest.
Absolutely. Lucy, we don't have a lot of parents on the podcast, and maybe that's something we should perhaps do a little bit more of in future, because I know we have some parents that listen too. I was wanting to just ask, we've been chatting about various things, the kind of pressure students feel, we touched on kind of distractions a moment ago. I just wondered if you had any advice for other parents out there who are, in your kind of shoes, worrying about their sons and daughters going through the exam process.
I think the most important thing is most of us as parents, and certainly one of my challenges being a coach, is that I'm always going to default to trying to find solutions and fixing, which is not the most useful approach to take. And also with, as our responsibility as parents, we feel we need to be monitoring and policing and have you studied? Are you studying? That must be the most annoying thing to be on the receiving end of. I know when we go into those conversations with our daughter, it's the worst thing and it just shuts down any kind of communication. So I think the most important opportunity for us as parents is to be really empathetic. I touched on this earlier, but to recognize that this is a really difficult time that feels like the hardest time many of the students will have lived through, and to be with them in that. There was a wonderful psychologist I was listening to recently talking about the emotional life of teenagers, and her approach, Lisa Darmore, I think she's called, was to sit in a place of a genderless presence. Rather than, are you studying? Have you studied? What's going on? When's your next? That's only going to increase the pressure. Whereas if we can just be there and recognize that there are going to be times when we maybe just take a drink or say, have a break, or just have a conversation about something that's not exams. That's one of the things my daughter says to me often, which is always a big, can we just not talk about exams for a minute? And it's certainly my advice to myself, because theory and practice are often two very different things, but just to sit in that place of empathy and a genderless presence with them. And I think that's also a message to students as well, that opportunity to be empathetic to and with yourself, to recognize that, I talk to a lot of the adults I work with about self-trust and having your own back, and the little voice that we can build in our internal conversation that said, you've got this, you'll be okay. Whatever happens, you're likely, we hope, to be lucky enough to wake up tomorrow morning. You'll be fine. You've got you. I think that empathy for ourselves, it's talked about in the coaching industry a lot as compassion or self-kindness, all of that stuff. Again, if these are habits that we can build early on in our lives, they'll stand us in really good stead. And we don't often teach our young people skills in self-compassion, in emotional agility. And I think that's an opportunity for us in the education system and as adults and as parents to build some of those skills and help ourselves and the young people that we have in our lives build those skills for themselves.
And how do we go about starting to build those skills? Like, what do we read? What do we learn? Like, are there any habits we do? Like, for someone listening and going, oh gosh, yeah, that sounds really helpful. How do I remind myself and get into these habits on a date in my day-to-day life? Where do we start?
I think that the really simple answer to that question is, first of all, the first skill is in noticing. And if you can start to notice and separate yourself from what you might be saying to yourself, what thought process is going through your mind, what's that voice in your head saying to you? If you can start to notice, I'm feeling something. What am I feeling? The ability to build our own emotional vocabulary, whether we're a student or a parent or an adult in an organization, we don't tend to go further than I feel mad, sad, or glad, the big three emotions. If we can, there's a huge difference between feeling frightened, scared, panicked, unsettled, that, in that conversation with yourself, that opportunity, first of all, to say, I'm feeling something. What is it? How can I label this really accurately? Because when you have an accurate label, you're in a much better position to then think about, okay, so it's sadness. I'm feeling sad. What's causing that? So it's that ability to build that conversation with yourself first and foremost. And then that opportunity, I think, there's all kinds of places you can go to explore techniques around meditation and journaling, which helps, but of course it does. But that first opportunity, I think, for all of us is to start the conversation with ourselves, to notice what's going in our thinking mind, what's going on in our hearts in terms of how we feel, and to just start to build our knowledge and awareness of how those different things, patterns in our thinking and behavior, we start to be able to pick up on. I think that would be my starting point.
Fantastic. Look, Lucy, it's been an absolute pleasure as before. Thank you so much once again for coming on, being so generous with your wisdom and your time. I'm really excited to share this with people. And what would be your kind of main message in closing for our listeners, be they students or parents or educators themselves?
I think for all of those different audiences that you've mentioned there, the key idea I would encourage people to take with them is this idea of really taking the time to see you, to observe yourself in action, and the way that you talk, the way that you think, the way that you behave is all an opportunity to learn in a different way. We've been talking about learning in the sense of exam knowledge and being able to retrieve the things that we know to answer questions. If you think of the whole of the journey of the lives that we live and the opportunities that come at different stages in our life, I think it's a very different kind of knowledge that we can grow and build. And the beauty, I think, of sitting and seeing yourselves is, and developing some practices around that, as we talked about, is regardless of whether it's a good day or a bad day, or if you've behaved or responded or reacted in a way that is consistent with who you want to be, or when you haven't, when you've messed up and got stuff wrong, it's all an opportunity to learn and grow and get another go to try again tomorrow. I think that's my opportunity. It's the one relationship that is there for the whole of our lives, from the minute we draw our first breath to the last breath that we exhale. The relationship with ourselves is the most central one. And by spending time and attention and focus in building that relationship, having our own back, showing compassion and care when things are tough, driving ourselves forward when we need to push ourselves in a different direction, that's our opportunity. And that's something that we've always got, that relationship with ourselves, regardless of circumstances, environments, or context. It's something that we can always grow and build. So there's an opportunity for all of us to build a really powerful, strong, loving relationship with ourselves. So that's my overall lasting message from this conversation today. I think that when we start to do that, everything changes.
Amazing. Well, look, Lucy, thank you so much once again. Where do we go to find out more about you and your world if people are interested?
Well, we have a slight change of website address. So idpartnership.org is our website address. ID Partnership on Instagram also is where you can find some of our content. And I'm always happy on our website, which is www.idpartnership.org. There's contact details for me. I'm always delighted to communicate directly with people. You've got all my contact details there if you want to pick up the conversation.
Fantastic. Lucy, thank you so much, and wishing your daughter every success this summer.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks once again, Lucy, for such a wonderful catch-up. It's always a pleasure and always so inspiring to hear your incredible wisdom. To close out tonight's programme, I want to feature two individuals you don't hear from quite so much on the podcast, Doctors Kerry Edinburgh and Alex Hibble. As I mentioned in the intro, they both contribute so much to what Exam Study Expert is now able to do for people. And so it was really important to me that a milestone episode like this one featured both of them. Kerry is the maestro behind much of our output on the blog these days. In her first ever segment on the Exam Study Expert podcast, here's what she had to say about what she wished she'd known in her own student days.
I'm Kerry, and I'm the blog editor at Exam Study Expert. Before joining Exam Study Expert, I studied at Cambridge University alongside William, and then went on to do a PhD in music history. So I have a lot of academic experience. I spent a great many years studying, and I actually did pretty well. And yet, I'm often writing about study strategies that make me think, yes, life would have been so much easier for 16-year-old or 22-year-old me if I'd known that. And it's often practical things like how to take notes that are actually useful for revising, how to make study timetables that aren't completely overwhelming and have 3 months on one calendar, let alone when we get to the really important stuff like retrieval practice. So yeah, the Exam Study Expert blog is a resource that I'm really proud to work on, and one that would definitely have helped me when I was a student.
And thank you, Kerry, for all your hard work on the blog. In the early days of us working together, Kerry was mainly taking my ideas from workshops, from the podcast, and turning them into articles. But she's a formidable researcher and has many very valuable ideas of her own too. And so many of her recent articles have been all her own work without kind of input from me. In particular, I would highly recommend her recent article on imposter syndrome, which I thought was a phenomenal piece of work and had many new insights I didn't know about that particular topic, based on her personal experiences and also the deep research she'd done in that area. I'll link that article in the show notes, well worth checking out if you're interested in the topic of imposter syndrome. I asked the same question to Alex. You may have heard Alex before if you caught episode 89 on friends and the social side of studying, or episode 90 on 4 handy brain health hacks. Alex now is in charge of a growing portion of our live workshop and speaking work, where we train both students and teaching staff in effective study strategy in schools and universities here in the UK, as well as leading our private coaching work for clients all around the world, where she particularly focuses on younger clientele at school level, as I've started to focus more on coaching older clientele, such as professionals taking exams as part of their career. So here's what Alex wished she'd figured out sooner.
Since working at Exam Study Expert, one of the ideas that I found most interesting, both in reflecting on my own time as a student and in speaking to students, is that our intuition about what revision strategies work well for us can be completely misleading. As an A-level student, I was one of these work really hard, rewrite your notes, rewrite your textbooks, and I would fill up notebooks with pages and pages, just rewriting the same passages. And because I was doing well in mocks and because I did well in my A-levels, I thought, this must be a really effective revision strategy. And it wasn't until I came to look more into the science of effective learning that I realized it's actually one of the least effective strategies out there. It involves absolutely no pulling information from memory, and it's just regurgitating information onto the page. So that's definitely the sort of top tip I would have given to my younger self is try and choose more effective revision strategies. And the second top tip, I think, is to stop thinking about revision and learning as completely separate entities. I thought about learning my A-level syllabus and learning my undergraduate syllabus, and when I learned it completely, 100%, knew it off by heart, then I would start revising. And actually, revision can be built into, as you're learning. You can start revising at a really early stage, even when you've only done a few weeks of a course. And then you don't have this sudden jolt when it gets to study leave where you're like, now I have to switch gears and suddenly I have to figure out how to revise. So that would be my second top tip, would be think about starting to revise just as part of the process of learning and getting started sooner.
Well, thank you, Alex. And you'll be able to hear more from Alex in her upcoming neurodiversity series, which we'll be co-hosting, but she'll be leading, coming your way on the podcast a little later this year. And what about the thing I wish I'd most known as a student? Well, I'm going to save that little tidbit for the end of next week's episode, when Alex will be interviewing me to tell my student story to kick off the next 100 episodes of the podcast as episode 101. In the meantime, do look out for a special bonus episode which will be hitting your podcast feed this week. I wanted to take the opportunity of the 100th anniversary to tell you a little bit more about the different ways I love to help students like you study smarter, including in that episode a very special announcement that I'm super excited to share, which marks the biggest step forward for Exam Study Expert since we launched this podcast itself back in 2019. I think that will be of a lot of interest to a good many of you, so do keep an eye out for that episode. Tune in, have a listen. For now, thank you so much as always for tuning in, particularly to today's 100th anniversary episode celebration extravaganza. Please do pick up your party bag on your way out. Not to kind of overextend this whole celebration event metaphor thing, but why don't we just stretch it that little bit more just this last once, and for party bag, you can read Exam Success Cheat Sheet, that one-page summary of all my favourite tips and tricks to study smarter. Yours to download free of charge if you haven't already done so at examstudyexpert.com/pillars. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for all your support of the show, for listening, sharing, replying to my emails, for all the other things you do. It's a huge pleasure to do this for you, and I really hope that you achieve the success you're looking for in your exams and in your studies. Thanks again for listening.
Wasn't that wonderful? If you're feeling inspired, why not leave us a rating and a review in your podcast app? It would make our day. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.